My name is Catherine Hellerstein. I'm the I'm the Ruth Meltzer Director of the Jewish Studies Program at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm going to introduce the introducer. I just want to say that this wonderful event is co-sponsored by a number of departments as well as Penn's Jewish Studies Program Kuchin Fund, which sponsors many of our lectures. Our co-sponsors in this event are Comparative Literature and Literary Theory, the Departments of English, Linguistics, Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, and the Penn Language Center and the Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing. So it's really wonderful to be here and to have so many friends in the university, and also to have so many people here in the room and also out there in Zoom land. As I said, I'm going to introduce the introducer. The introducer of our wonderful speaker is Joseph Benatov. He's my colleague. I should say Dr. Joseph Benatov. He is the director of the Hebrew Language Program in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, and the associate director of the Jewish Studies Program. Joseph is a wonderful colleague. I've known him for many years. He has a Penn PhD from the program in comparative literature, and he is an expert scholar, a real authority on Bulgarian Jewry. So with that, I will step aside and let Joseph take over.
Thank you, Catherine. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I will introduce our speaker in a second. Before that, a couple of additional acknowledgements and thank yous. First of all, I want to thank my colleague, Ibrahim Miari, for initially suggesting the idea. We wouldn't be here, and Gil Hovav would not be here if it wasn't for Ibrahim's suggestion. I do want to thank Chrissy Walsh, our wonderful coordinator at the Jewish Studies Program. She's always wonderful for any event that we organize, but I think for this one, she went above and beyond even her own skills. So thank you. And a couple of very quick sort of personal connections. I know that all of us are excited to have such a noted visitor from Israel here. And in my case, I happen to be excited for a couple of personal reasons. First one, as you heard, is that I teach Hebrew, and knowing that we'll be talking about the revival of the Hebrew language and what Eliezer Ben-Yehuda did, I can't help but, occasionally think sort of an alternate history scenario of if things hadn't gone the way they did, where I would be now, what I would be doing for a living, if things had not evolved the way they did. And I try to imagine myself as a pediatrician or a bus driver or something, and I'm never able to do that. So thank you, Gil Hovav, for your great-grandfather making all the right choices historically. And then secondly, as Catherine mentioned, I'm originally from Bulgaria. And, occasionally Bulgarians, because as a nation in Europe, it's not one of the most important European nations, sadly. Sometimes, Bulgarians try to put the country in the epicenter of world events that have nothing to do with local history. However, in Eliezer Ben-Yehuda's case, it's actually not that difficult to make a proper historical connection, because some of you may know that, when Eliezer Ben-Yehuda wrote, I guess, his very first article back in 1879 as a young student in Paris, he introduced his vision of a new nation to emerge with a new national language. And he used as a very recent example Bulgaria, where the nation had just been liberated from 5 centuries of Ottoman rule. It had gained independence. The people had their own national language, and this was very fresh and sort of burning in Eliezer Ben-Yehuda's mind, which, again, for me, I see sort of a personal connection there. Now, I would like to introduce Gil Hovav and move along with our talk. Gil Hovav is a noted Israeli food critic, culinary journalist, television and radio host, publisher, novelist, cookbook author, chef, and somewhat of a language purist. He's the great-grandson of Eliezer Ben-Yehuda, the grandson of Itamar Ben-Avi, who began modern Hebrew journalism, and the son of Moshe and Gil Hovav, founding members of Israel's modern-day public radio. Gil created, produced, and presented some of Israel's most iconic food shows, which later also became best-selling cookbooks. He's also the author of best-selling novels, short story collections, a children's book, and over a dozen cookbooks. During his illustrious career in journalism, publishing, television, and as an author, Gil played a major role in the revival of Israeli cuisine and the change Israel has undergone in recent years from a country of basic traditional foods into a gourmet nation. For the past 34 years, Gil has lived with his partner Dan, whom he met during their army service, and together they've raised their 18-year-old daughter, Naomi. Without further ado, please help me welcome Gil Hovav.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for this wonderful eulogy. Shalom, everybody. I'm very excited to be here and honored, of course. And I'll start by saying that you may not know it, but I owe you big time. So let me explain. So as you've heard, I'm Gil Hovav. I'm 60 years old, born in Jerusalem, live in Tel Aviv like everybody else. For the past 34 years, I'm with Danny, my partner. He was my officer in the intelligence service. Danny is a professor of computer science in the Tel Aviv University. Now, I hope it is clear to all of you that I married beneath me. Because, you know, he's a mere professor of computer science in the university. I'm Gil Hovav, come on. But for some reason, he thinks he's superior. Well, actually for 2 reasons. First, he says that I know nothing about math, which is not true. I know math. It's just division that I try to shy away from. And secondly, he says, you don't like classical music, which I don't. So one day, about, well, 5 years ago or so, I get a phone call from the Israeli Philharmonic. They have this series, the Philharmonic in Jeans. Basically, it's concerts for idiots. And they're trying to, you know, to get big audiences. So they have celebrities host the concerts. And being a minor celebrity in Israel, they asked me to host a concert. Now, what do I know of classical music? Nothing, but I knew that Danny would be shocked. So immediately I said yes, and they said, good, it's in 2 days. So it was clear that someone said yes and then ran away, and then, never mind, I'll do it. So here I am on the stage of Heichal HaTarbut, like the biggest hall in Tel Aviv, interviewing on stage, you know, opera singers and violinists and you name it. And I see all through the concert, I see Danny's eyes shimmering with terror in the crowd. By the end of the concert, he came to pick me up from the green room. And I was sure he would say it was terrible or something like this. He looked at me gray-faced and he said, that was the end of Western civilization. Now, just think of Danny hearing that I'm lecturing in UPenn. He would die. And it's all because of you. So thank you very, very, very much. I really appreciate it. I owe you. Okay, let's start. I would like to start with a confession. So in my family, I'm a great-grandson of Eliezer Ben-Yehuda, the reviver of Hebrew, who died exactly 100 years ago. He died in 1922. So in our family, in the Ben-Yehuda family, we tend to rank cities according to the size of the Ben-Yehuda street that we got. So Jerusalem is cool. It's a part of the triangle that forms the CBD of Jerusalem. Tel Aviv is wonderful. It's a big, big, big avenue parallel to the beach. Be'er Sheva, Rehovot, Haifa. Philadelphia could, try harder, okay? But maybe by my next visit, everything will be fine. I trust you. Let's start our talk near the end. So picture me 35 years ago, when I was 25 years old. I was an apprentice in a newspaper. I started from rock bottom. If they would, have a new rack of socks in the department stores, I would put in a line and I would be sure that I was Emile Zola. But I like sitting at the desk of the newspaper and see how newspapers happen, how things become headlines. So one evening, I was at the desk of the newspaper and we got word that it happened yet again. What happened yet again? So had you been Jerusalemites, you may have been aware of the fact that in Jerusalem, we have a very nice tradition that at least once a year, sometimes even twice a year, members of the ultra-Orthodox community in Jerusalem, the super religious, the Neturei Karta, arm themselves with axes and bats and bottles of black spray, go up to the Mount of Olives, to the old Jewish cemetery in the middle of the night, break into the burial plot of my family, which is surrounded by a fence, desecrate all the graves, and smear the nasty graffitis on the broken tombstones. And then City Hall fixes it, and then it happens yet again, and then City Hall fixes it for years and years and years. And it happened, and I didn't know whether I should call my aunt, who was still alive, and let her know that the graves of her parents and her aunts and her uncles and her grandparents were desecrated yet again. It's not a pleasant piece of news to convey to an elderly aunt. I won't tell you what I did. If you behave, maybe I'll tell you in the end. But in the meantime, let's think about it. What was it, and what is it still in this short, annoying, red-headed, blood-coughing person that keeps everybody so charged with his figure up until today, 100 years from his death? This person who wasn't nice, who was very sensitive about his honor. What is it that on one hand makes religious, ultra-Orthodox religious people in Jerusalem arm themselves with bats and go up to his grave to desecrate his grave, and on the other hand makes UNESCO, the culture organization of the UN, declare him in a big ceremony in Paris some 13 years ago, together with Haydn and Newton? None of them appeared, by the way, but the three of them were declared three of Western civilization's greatest culture figures. What is it that makes people so emotionally involved with what he did? So Eliezer Perelman, that's the original name, was born in Lithuania in 1858, mid-19th century, to a typical Jewish family of Eastern Europe in the mid-19th century, very religious, very poor. A few years after he was born, his father passed away. His mom was left with 5 kids. And within a few years, she had to make a choice that nowadays would look, to us, would look satanic, but in fact was quite common in those times. She realized that she does not have enough bread to put on the table for 5 children, and one of the children has to go. And she picked little Eliezer. She said, he's the sharpest of them all. Maybe with his wits, he'll be able to survive. And he was sent to be educated at the house of a distant relative, not rich, but at least not dirt poor. An uncle who was very strict, very religious, didn't like the fact that he had yet another mouth to feed. And he grew up without love. Well, years later, when he was already, an important person in the world, an American journalist interviewed him, and started the interview by asking, as we journalists usually do, well, to begin with, why don't you tell me a bit about your childhood? And he snapped, well, I didn't have one. And it's true, he did not have a childhood. He was immediately spotted as an Ilui, as a genius, and he studied in a cheder, in a traditional Jewish school. And we're talking about the mid-19th century. Hebrew is dead for 2,000 years. It may be the language of writings, it may be the language of even poetry and prayer, but nobody speaks it. For 2,000 years, it's nobody's mother tongue. Think of Latin today, it's the same, okay? No baby speaks Latin when he or she are born. But we're talking about the Enlightenment era, Tkufat HaHaskala, mid-19th century. Jewish scholars in Germany and in the north of France started toying with their synagogue language and try to see whether they can translate into it modern writings as a game. And one of Eliezer Perelman's rabbis was interested in Hebrew that way. And through this rabbi, he got hold of a book, which is not the Bible, the Mishnah, or the Talmud, but a book of this strange translation of modern writings into Old Hebrew. So would you know what was the first Hebrew book, except for holy books, that the reviver of Hebrew read in his life? Robinson Crusoe. A very, very naive translation of Robinson Crusoe. He reads it, he falls in love with the language. He knows that this would be his thing from now on. One night, his uncle catches him in bed reading, for God's sake, reading Robinson Crusoe, not Playboy, Robinson Crusoe. But you know, the Jewish kids were not supposed to read outer books, books that do not deal with religion. And his uncle says, you cast shame upon my family and upon this house. Take your tefillin and leave. Now think of it, winter, Eastern Europe, a 15-year-old kid is sent away with the kickers in behind, nowhere to go, no family, no friends, nothing. What would he do? He said, I'll walk towards the east. Maybe one day I'll get to Moscow. And here starts a chain of, I'm laughing because I'm going to say miracles, and it's funny to talk about miracles in connection with Eliezer Ben-Yehuda because he never, ever, ever believed for one day in his life in God. Never. He was totally secular, but there is no other way to explain what happens to him without talking about miracles. So miracle number one, he, yes, as I said, is walking from one town to another village in Eastern Europe. It's before the 2 world wars. Eastern Europe is scattered with Jewish towns and villages. If he's lucky, a generous family would offer him a bed for the night. If he's unlucky, he would be sleeping in the synagogue. Miracle number one, he sleeps on a bench in the synagogue. Into the synagogue walks a rich Jewish person, Shlomo Naftali Herz Yonas, a vodka maker for the Tsar. These are my genes. And sees the young man on the bench and starts talking with him and asks, who are you? What are you doing here? Don't you have a home? And he's so impressed with the wits of the young man that he tells him, you know what? Come and be a tutor for my children. Now, if we're talking about the 19th century, it's not like today where if our children have problems with math or with a foreign language, a teacher would come, a private teacher would come for an hour. It's a resident tutor. He lives with the family and he's in charge of the education of the children of the Yonas family. His way of thanking Mr. Yonas for saving him from starvation and from homelessness and you name it, is coming up to him after a year and telling him, well, Mr. Yonas, for the past year, I've been having an affair with your daughter. Actually, we're doing it. And I'm going to marry her and take her to Palestine. And there we would teach everybody to speak Hebrew. Compared to nowadays situation. It's as if someone would come to you and say, for the past year, I've been having a forbidden romance with your daughter. I'm going to marry her. Take her to Rwanda in Africa. And there, we would teach everybody to speak Latin. Very logical, right? Mr. Yonas looks at him and says, a brilliant idea. But before you take my daughter to Palestine, which was a God-forsaken province at the edge of the failing Ottoman Empire, filled with poverty and illness and you name it, you're such a bright young man. Let me send you at my own expense to Paris, to the Sorbonne. You'll study medicine. You'll become a doctor. Everybody needs a doctor all over the world. When you go to Palestine, you'll be able to support my daughter and your children. And Eliezer Perelman thinks about it for a minute and says, you know what? Okay, takes the money, goes to Paris, sends beautiful letters about his studies at the Sorbonne, never sets foot in the Sorbonne, sits in cafes with politicians and journalists, drinks all his money, and contracts tuberculosis, which is a death sentence in those times. He's sent to try to recover in Algeria, and there in Algeria, two more miracles. Miracle number one, he meets a Frank, a Sephardi Jew. He never saw such a thing. Now, this is a Sephardi Jew from Jerusalem. Sephardi Jews in Jerusalem knew a tiny bit more Hebrew than the Ashkenazi Jews. So for the first time in his life, he hears Hebrew spoken in the Sephardi accent. Now, it's very, very, very different from Hebrew in the Ashkenazi accent. If we'll take a verse of our national poet, Chaim Nachman Bialik, who, by the way, detested Eliezer Ben-Yehuda, but was a great poet. So if we'll take a verse of Bialik and recite it in the Ashkenazi accent, it's Shalom Rav Shuvach Tzipora Nechmedes. It's very round and sweet and Central European. But if we recite it in the Sephardi accent, it's Shalom Rav Shuvach Tzipora Nechmada. It's much more majestic. And Eliezer Perelman, the Ashkenazi Eliezer Perelman from Lithuania, hears this and says, this is what Hebrew should sound like. And this is how he spoke, with Resh and Het and Ain, with an Arab accent for the rest of his life. Miracle number two, this secular person writes in his memoir that one night he lies in bed, there's a lightning in the sky, and a big voice thunders upon him, the revival of the Jewish people in its own country, in its own language. And he knows that this would be his vocation. He gets back to Paris, being at least honest, annoying, but honest. He sends a telegram to Dvora, Yonas, his fiance in Lithuania, telling her, I'm really doing it. I'm really going to Palestine to teach all the Jews to speak Hebrew. Palestine is no place for a young, well-educated, well-mannered, delicate lady like yourself. You're exempt from this marriage. You may marry whoever you will. But Dvora is a tough cookie, and she won't let anyone fire her from her marriage by telegram. She conducts a marriage without him. She marries him when he's away. All night long, she dances in a white wedding gown with friends and relatives. The groom is in another country. At midnight, she sits down for one last game of chess with her father. He plays tough. At 3 a.m., he wins. He says, checkmate, Dvora. Maybe it's a sign. Maybe it's not such a good idea. Maybe you shouldn't go to Palestine. She looks at her father and she says, I'm unlucky in games because I'm lucky in love. Takes off her wedding gown, puts on a black suit, a black man's suit, and starts stealing the border in trains. Jews could not travel freely in those times, stealing the border in night trains to the west until she gets to Paris, grabs him by the collar, and tells Eliezer Perelman, you promised to marry me, and marry me you will. They get on a ship, sail to Palestine. On the way, they stop in Alexandria, they get married in Egypt, and they get to Jaffa, to the port of Palestine in 1881. This is very, 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 very early Zionism. It's 20 years before the Congress of Herzl. And they get to Jaffa, And in Jaffa, Eliezer Perelman says three things. One, my name is no longer Eliezer Perelman. It's Eliezer Ben-Yehuda. Ben-Yehuda, the son of Judah. First of all, his dad's name was Judah. But secondly, Judah, Yehuda, is the name of the country. I'm the son of this country. And actually, Ben-Yehuda is the name that many Zionists took to themselves to show that they shed the diaspora behind and that they start a new life. Two, he says, I did not come to Palestine to be in Jaffa. I want to go to Jerusalem. Now, nowadays, a trip from Jaffa to Jerusalem, depending on traffic, would be 50 minutes or something like this. No, I want to go to Jerusalem right now. In those times, a horse and carriage through the winding road that goes uphill to Jerusalem with wolves and thieves and gangs, you name it. Everybody tells him tomorrow. No, right now, in the middle of the night, they drive to Jerusalem. And three, he looks at Dvorah, his wife, and he tells her, now we are making a vow that as of today, where our legs are on the land of Israel, we would never, ever utter even one foreign language, a word. Now think about it. It's difficult. They were very well educated. They knew the Bible and they knew the Mishnah and they knew the Talmud. But in the Bible, so they knew Hebrew, but in the Bible, people do not make omelets. So if she wants to make an omelet, she can't say, Eliezer, give me there is no word for a pan, and it's forbidden to say a pan in Russian or French or German or Yiddish or any other language that they spoke. So she should say, Eliezer, give me that round metal thing so I can, there is no verb for scrambling, so I can confuse eggs until we get that thing that you eat in the morning, because you cannot say an omelet, right? And he would think about it, and then he'll remember that in the Bible, there is a word called chavitim. Chavitim is a dish made from eggs, and from chavitim, he will make machvat, which is a pan, and chavita, which is an omelet. But up until that moment, you can only describe with other words what you need. And if by any chance, any of them utters a foreign word, the other one has every right to pinch him. Remember those pinches? We'll get back to them. Life in Jerusalem was very difficult. The Jewish community in Jerusalem was totally non-Zionist. Yeah? Jews did not want to have a state. Jews did not want to cause any problems to the Ottoman rulers of the country. The few Zionists were in the settlements, but in the four cities, Jaffa, Jerusalem, Safed, and Tiberias, Jews were not Zionists at all. And they didn't want to hear of Hebrew. Now, if you come to a hostile city and you want to make all the Jews in this city speak Hebrew and they don't want to, where would you start? It's complicated, right? So one day I was giving this lecture in a kibbutz to children, and I told them, where would he start? And the kids did not want to answer, except for one who said, I have a brilliant idea. I know. I said, yes. Tell him to open a bank in Hebrew. Jews love money. It would work. He didn't open a bank. There were three means of promoting Hebrew. One, journalism. He starts two rival daily newspapers, which he hands out for free, because if it's for free, Jews would take it. And these were not the respectable newspapers of the time. The respectable newspapers were in the languages of culture, Arabic and French, of course. But little by little, Jews started, just picking those strange leaflets of Ben-Yehuda Amshuga, Ben-Yehuda the crazy, as they called him, just to see whether they can understand what he writes about with their synagogue language. Second means of promoting Hebrew, education. He says, my generation, his generation, is lost. Children should be taught in Hebrew, and then their parents would follow them. But how? First of all, again, in the cities, nobody wanted to hear of Hebrew. But in the settlements, even if teachers agreed to be teaching in Hebrew, there were no books in Hebrew, there were no games in Hebrew, there were no songs in Hebrew. He wrote them all by himself, not with great talent, but at least the teachers had something to work with, and little by little, children started speaking Hebrew, and after them, their parents. And the third means of promoting Hebrew, we're talking about a revolution here, and there is no revolution without violence. So a few stories about Ben-Yehuda violence. First story, we all know Rehovot, a nice city in central Israel with a big important university in the middle, the Weizmann Institute. At the time, a village of Russian Jewish farmers, immigrants from Russia, growing vines, and there's only one path in the center of Rehovot, not an avenue, a would-be avenue, but a narrow path with not trees on both sides, but bushes with inspirations. And the farmers at dusk, when they come back home, they walk to and fro with their wives on this path and talk about whatever happened during the day. The children of Rehovot got a task from their teachers to hide behind the bushes and listen. In which languages do their parents discuss whatever happened during the day? And if, God forbid, they were speaking Yiddish or Russian, the kids had permission to jump from behind the tree and prick their parents' tuches with a needle that they got from Eliezer Ben-Yehuda. And hence, by violence, we conquered Rehovot, and now everybody speaks Hebrew in Rehovot. Story number 2. A few years ago, I get an email from a lady whom I did not know, and she writes, "Dear Mr. Hovav, my father, Mr. Puchachevsky, passed away. I want to publish a book of his writings. One of the things that I want to include in this book is a letter that he wrote to my mom about a visit to the Ben-Yehuda residence. And I ask for your permission." I answer her, "It's very polite of you, but even according to Israeli law, if one side of the correspondence is okay with its publication, it's totally kosher. Go for it, it's yours." She says, "Young man, you want to read this letter before I publish it?" I say, okay, send it over. In the letter about the visit to the Ben-Yehuda residence, now when we say residence, they were so poor that they lived in a studio apartment on the second floor in the market in the old city. The only problem was that the building did not have a staircase. So if they wanted to enter or leave their apartment, they had to use a ladder and go through the window. But anyway, in his visit to the Ben-Yehuda residence, Mr. Puchachevsky writes to his wife that he sat with Eliezer Ben-Yehuda at his desk, and when Dvorah, his wife, entered the room and laid a tray of tea and cookies on the table, he saw that both her arms were black from bruises of pinches. Now, this is not funny, and this is not amusing, and this is not nice. It's repulsive. He was violent. Now, he didn't beat up his wife, but when he pinched, he pinched. But you see, he was a prophet. He was a prophet. And the problem with prophets and revolutionists is that they lack a sense of humor. They cannot read reality from two sides. They see only one truth, but sometimes, in some cases, when the shining light that they see is a true one, we gain from it. I did not know him. Of course, he died 40 years before I was born. I did not know my grandfather, the first Hebrew child we will talk about in a second. But I knew some other kids of Eliezer Ben-Yehuda. They admired him. And he was a very unpleasant father. They called him a back father because he would be working, standing up with his back to the room. In those years, you didn't sit down to your desk. You stood up and you respected your work. So you worked standing up. So he would be working 18 hours a day, coughing blood with tuberculosis, and with his back to the room. It was forbidden to them to address him. if they wanted to speak to their father, they had to hand in a written request to their mom. And then a week later, they got a 5-minute interview with their dad. But they admired him. They never stopped thanking, not God, because in my family, the relationship is not that close with God, but destiny, okay? For the privilege they had of living with such great men. And whenever they would talk about him, they never said dad, they never said my father, they never said father. They would always tell me, my illustrious father. They admired him. And he was, you know, a one-trick pony and slightly crazy. We must admit it, a story. So as I told you, the relationship between the ultra-Orthodox community in Jerusalem and the Ben-Yehuda family was not tense. It was just war, because for the religious, the ultra-Orthodox, not the religious. The religious, he was very good friends with. He was a close friend of Rabbi Cook and of this rabbi and that rabbi. But the ultra-Orthodox thought that Hebrew should stay language synagogue. You should not go to the toilet in Hebrew. You should not go to the bedroom in Hebrew, to the bank in Hebrew. So for them, it was a blasphemy that people would start speaking Hebrew. And they threw stones at him, they boycotted him, they would not trade with him, they refused to bury his dead, they told the Ottoman rulers of the country that he was a British spy, and he sat for half a year in jail, not that he was a spy, etc., etc., etc. So the house of the Ben-Yehuda family, when they moved from that tiny apartment, was on the main road that led from the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods of Jerusalem, and the only hospital that was in Jerusalem in those years. One eve of Shabbat, one Friday night, the family sits down for dinner, and suddenly there's screaming from the street, the voice of a young woman, hysterical, shouting in Yiddish, Gewalt, Gewalt, Mamale, Gewalt, I'm dying. God, help me, Jews, Gewalt, I'm dying here on the street. The kids rush to the balcony, look down. What do they see? In their yard, there's a Haredi young woman lying on her back, giving birth. Turns out that the lady was 9 months pregnant. She was in labor. It was the eve of Shabbat. She didn't want, well, they didn't have taxis back then, but she didn't want to take a horse and carriage to the hospital because maybe Shabbat would enter and it would be a Chilul Shabbat. So she trusted God and started walking to the hospital, but God was busy elsewhere. And with her luck, the water broke, and here she is lying in the garden of Ben-Yehuda the crazy, shouting hysterically in Yiddish, Gewalt, Gewalt, Jews, I'm dying, Mama le Gewalt. The kids get hysterical too. They rush back home, grab their father by his sleeve, do something. Eliezer Ben-Yehuda goes to the balcony, looks down, she shouts Gewalt, he looks at her and he says, shout in Hebrew, and goes back in. So that's the relationship that there was. It wasn't very pleasant. My grandfather, the first Hebrew child, was born in 1891. And he was decided, he was the victim of Hebrew, actually. He was the guinea pig of Hebrew. His father decided that this would be the first child after 2,000 years that would speak Hebrew from the cradle. Yeah, Hebrew would be his mother tongue. And for this, in order to achieve this, they sealed him off from reality. They never let anyone speak any other language but Hebrew. They didn't want to damage his ears. But nobody spoke Hebrew, so there were no children to play with, of course. Even the neighbor that helped Dvorah, my great-grandmother, with her child, is called in our family the mute auntie. Not that she was mute, but she made a vow not to speak in the presence of the child. And for 4 years, he was locked either at home or in the yard with only a dog for a friend. And when he was 4 years old, he ran away with his dog and they started walking on the street, and immediately Haredi kids started chasing them and throwing stones at them. He was wounded and the dog was killed. They killed his only friend in the world. And Eliezer Ben-Yehuda buries the dog in the yard and writes on the tombstone, "Here lies the first Hebrew dog." So life was very, very, very difficult. And they were dirt poor. And then Dvorah contracts tuberculosis and dies. And 3 of their children die immediately after her. And Eliezer Ben-Yehuda is left with 2 orphans, my grandfather and his sister. And he writes a telegram to the Yonas family that moved already to Moscow. "Your elder daughter died. 3 of our children died. I want to marry her younger sister," who was 15 years younger than himself. Beile was her name. He gets a reply, "A brilliant idea." Now, come on, what's wrong with them? So for years, I was wondering, what was it in this short, blood-coughing, red-headed, annoying person that made all the Yonas women want to marry him? But I couldn't ask, because if I asked for his father, I would get smacked. Eventually, when I was 35, I got the nerve to ask Dola. Dola is the daughter of Eliezer Ben-Yehuda and that second sister that he married. So she's half sister, half cousin of my grandfather. And Dola was, nowadays we would give it a name, like something with 4 letters, ADHD or something like this. We call it a soul and a half trapped in the body of one person. She was always very ditzy and she couldn't sit down and she would be breathless all the time. And I asked her, "Dola, why did they want to marry him?" And she said, "Gili, let me tell you something. All of my life, I have been asking the same question until I got the nerve to ask my aunt Pnina." Pnina is the 3rd sister who immigrated from Russia to the States. And Pnina told me, "Dola, my sweet, now I will reveal my secret. All of my life, I have been praying that your mother would be well, but I would add to God that maybe if something would happen to her, maybe he marries me too." So there's no explanation except for the fact that he was deadly sexy, which runs in the family. And this wasn't a joke. People in Jerusalem tell him, "What are you doing? You killed the first one. You'll kill the second one. She's 15 years younger than yourself. She could be your daughter. She's a chemistry student in one of the best universities in the world. What does she need to come to be the wife of an old widower who is going to die? Leave her alone." And he is persuaded, and like he did with her elder sister, he sends a telegram saying, "Maybe it's not such a good idea. You don't have to marry me." He gets a telegram back. "On my way to you, wait for a letter." And he gets a letter. And in the letter, she writes, "I'm coming to Palestine. Be it for a day, be it for a year, be it for the rest of my life. This is my destiny." And they meet in Turkey. They get married in Turkey. They sail to Palestine. They get to Jaffa. And they take a carriage and a horse and go up the winding road to meet the 2 orphans of her sister that are waiting for her at the gates of Jerusalem. And she wrote about it in one of her books. This book wasn't published. Other books of hers were published. And one day I went to the National Library and I took the manuscript and I read it. And I read about this trip that she's making. Immediately when they got married, he changed their name, of course. He told her, "Your name is not Beile anymore. Your name is Chemda." And Chemda writes about this trip to Jerusalem to meet the 2 orphans that are waiting for her at the gates of Jerusalem. And I read it and I tell myself, this is aristocracy. This is our Mayflower. This is how Zionism was done. And then she gets to the point where she meets them and she says, "And then I saw the children at the gates of Jerusalem. 2 such ugly, filthy apes I've never seen in my life." And I tell myself, Gil Hovav, this is the aristocracy that you are. A filthy, ugly ape. Remember for good. We should talk a bit about Chemda because, often history is unkind to women and attributes achievements of women to the men they shared their lives with. Now, there is no doubt that the big dictionary and that the revival of Hebrew as a spoken language are achievements of Eliezer Ben-Yehuda, nobody else. But we would have never had the dictionary had it not been for Chemda. So when I lecture to young people, I tell them, I would assume that you've never seen the big Ben-Yehuda dictionary. It's huge. It's as big as the Encyclopedia Britannica. And then they all look at me and say, as big as what? I say, it's as big as Wikipedia, okay? It's immense. It's something that a nation would take upon itself to do, not one sickly person standing up 18 hours a day, coughing blood and writing. And publishing a volume, there are 17 volumes in this dictionary. Publishing one volume cost, in those days, $500,000. $500,000. In her memoir, Chemda writes that they were so poor that there were days that the only thing that was put in their mouth is the glue of the stamps with which they were sending the newspapers to the settlements. $500,000, where from? She got it all by herself. She traveled the world at the turn, a woman alone at the turn of the 20th century, by camel, by train, by sheep, to Algeria and to Iraq and to Germany and to the States and to England and to France and to Russia and you name it, to beg, borrow, and steal. And little by little, one volume after another, the dictionary was published. Eliezer Ben-Yehuda didn't get to see the complete dictionary published. When he died, and we'll talk about it in a second, only 5 volumes were published. The big victory that he got to see was the victory in what we call the War of Languages. So in 1910, word got out that for the first time after 2,000 years, a Jewish university is going to be built in the land of Israel, in Palestine. The Technion in Haifa. Money was donated by rich Jews in Germany. It's before the World Wars. And it was clear that the Technion, which is a technical university, would be teaching in the language of science. Now, nowadays, the language of science is English with a foreign accent, of course. But at the time, it was German. And Eliezer Ben-Yehuda knew that if after 2,000 years, the first Jewish university is going to be teaching in German and not in Hebrew, he lost his cause. Being the annoying person that he was, he makes all the teachers in Palestine sign a petition telling the donors in Germany, if this university is going to be teaching in German, we're not going to be teaching in it. The Germans are not impressed. They say, in any case, we planned on sending teachers from Germany. Being the annoying person that he was, he makes all the students in Palestine sign a petition saying, send students as well, because we won't study in this university. And the building of the Technion stops for 4 years. There are riots and demonstrations, and blood is on the streets, and people are arrested. And only 4 years later is it opened in Hebrew. And in 1921, 1 year before he dies, he gets to be invited to the ceremony of laying the cornerstone of a university in Jerusalem. Now, I'm a graduate of this university, and we all know the University of Jerusalem is called the Hebrew U. No, it's called the Hebrew U because it pledged to teach in Hebrew. This is how it got its name, and he got to see it. He died in 1922 on the eve of Shabbat, when the Chevre Kadisha, the burial service, the ultra-Orthodox burial service, came to take his body on Sunday, they saw that he died with his pen in his hand. And they said, what a heathen, that even at his very death, he was doing Chilul Shabbat. Jews are not supposed to write on Shabbat. And when he died, only 5 volumes of the dictionary, 5 of the 17, were published. So I would like to almost end this talk with a very sweet amusing story that I've heard about how Chemda, his wife, died because she took it upon herself to go on with the publication of the dictionary. My grandfather, the first Hebrew child, Itamar ben Avi, helped her, and later on her other son, Ehud, helped her. And little by little, more and more volumes were published. And in 1952, when she died, 11 volumes were published. Now, I want to tell you the story of how she died. This is a story that I've heard from her grandson. So Chemda and Eliezer Ben-Yehuda had a son named Ehud. Ehud had a boy and a girl. The boy he named Eliezer, after his father, and the girl he named Eliezra, after his father. So the boy's name is Eliezer. We call him Eliezer HaKatan. Little Eliezer is a big guy, born in Jerusalem. Today, he's a rabbi in Florida. Eliezer Ben-Yehuda rolls in his grave like this, a rabbi in our family. But the sweetest man, a cool guy, speaks perfect Hebrew, of course. And he told me how his grandmother, Chemda Ben-Yehuda, died. Chemda Ben-Yehuda was a terrifying woman. All of Jerusalem was terrified of her. Anyway, she was bedridden, she was sick, she was at home with her grandson, 8 years old, and she calls him to her room and she says, Eliezer, I'm going to give you a note. On this note, there's a telephone number. Dial it and say that Chemda Ben-Yehuda says that David and Moshe must come right away. He dials, they come. What do we learn from this story? That in Israel of 1952, when an 8-year-old kid dies the office of the prime minister and says, my grandmother says that David and Moshe must come right away, David Ben-Gurion, the prime minister, and Moshe Sharet, the secretary of state, come right away because they were terrified of her. She was a horrible, horrible, horrible woman. And she lies in bed covered to her chin. She looks up at them and they're standing like this next to her bed. And she says, guys, I'm going to die, but I won't die until you promise me that the big dictionary is going to be published to the end. Now they were so terrified that immediately they went, it's me, say it with your own mouth. So they said yes, and she died. But because of her and because of him, I have a homeland, and I have a culture, and I have a language, and I have an identity, and I have my pride. I know who I am. And I have a daughter that every morning when she opens her eyes, she doesn't say je t'aime, and she doesn't say ana bahebak, and she doesn't say I love you. She says ani ohevet otcha. So I guess it was worth it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Because you are really well behaved, I'll just finish the first story that I owe you. So picture me at the desk of the newspaper, getting word that it happened yet again. The graves are desecrated. I didn't know whether I should call my aunt, not call my aunt. Eventually I said, the news are not mine. She'll hear about it anyway. I phoned her. I said, Aunt Rina, I'm so sorry. I have some unpleasant news. It happened yet again. And my aunt told me, Gili, you only get word of it, or did you get photos as well? And I said, leave it. I'll send my elderly aunt photos of the desecrated graves of the family. And she said, no. You don't have to send me anything. I want you to look at the photos. I said, okay. She said, the nasty graffitis. In which language? I said, in Hebrew. And she said, yes, we won. Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. And if you have any questions about Hebrew, about Eliezer Ben-Yehuda, about myself, about Israel, I'll be very happy to answer whatever is left unclear. It's all clear, which is good. So thank you very, very much for listening. And don't forget, learn Hebrew, but it's even more important to learn Arabic. One shouldn't die not knowing Arabic. So remember this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Hashem Dank, but don't kill me. That's Yiddish. Toda rabah. Don't sit down. I'm gonna wander around with the microphone if people have questions. And then we also may have questions on Zoom. How many people do we have on Zoom? A lot. 60 people on Zoom. So there may be some questions from Zoom, which Joseph will articulate. So anybody have questions? I'll hand you the mic. To Michael, the mic.
Thanks so much for your talk. I'm wondering whether Agnon, who wrote about those years in Jerusalem and who had ideas of Hebrew of his own, wrote anything about your great-grandfather.
Of course, he couldn't stand him. Not Agnon, not Bialik, and not Brenner. The three of them, the three big literary figures of Hebrew literature, detested Eliezer Ben-Yehuda, and I'll explain why. For them, he was a nobody. They didn't understand where he came from, and they didn't understand at what right did he think that he can change Hebrew. Now, everybody was for the revival of Hebrew, but Bialik, for instance, thought that there should be a committee in Odessa that would think of words and would look at the Bible. Now, at the time, you know, the revival of the land of Israel was done by people from the Ukraine and Iraq and Yemen and the States and France and Germany. They did not have a common language. The Tower of Babel collapsed because the Masons did not have a common language. So they would be sending letters saying, what do we call those scissors with which we pluck grapes from the vine? And Bialik said, we will send a letter to Odessa. And Eliezer Ben-Yehuda said, Mazmera. Say Mazmera, everything is okay. So they didn't like this rapidness of Eliezer Ben-Yehuda. And Agnon, who was a genius, of course, was very sarcastic about Eliezer Ben-Yehuda. In one of his letters, he tells someone who comes to visit Palestine, he says, and if you want to hear Hebrew, maybe you should go to the Ben-Yehuda residence where Ben-Yehuda and Haben Shel Ben-Yehuda, Ben-Yehuda's son, and the wife of Ben-Yehuda stutter some Hebrew. So it was very much against him.
I have very much enjoyed this. I am a linguist, retired from Penn. And so I have very much a linguist's question. The name Chemza, does that begin with a het, a uvular het?
Do I speak with a het or with a het?
Yes.
The pronunciation.
Yes.
So my case is a bit weird. First of all, nowadays in Israel, most of us speak with the Ashkenazi accent, with a dry accent, with a het, not with a het. My dad, who was Israel's #1 news announcer, was Yemenite by origin. I mean, his grandparents were born in Israel, but he was from Yemenite descent, so his pronunciation was very Mizrahi, with het and ayn and resh. So I speak sometimes like this and sometimes like that. How do I spell Chemda? Chemda is with a het, of course. Yeah, sure. Yes, Chemda. Chemda.
How did your grandfather feel about cognates? Like in Hebrew, banana is banana. Like words that are kind of Hebrew, but not really.
My great-grandfather, I guess, that you mean Eliezer Ben-Yehuda.
Great-grand.
So, you know, it's funny because he was very free-spirited when it came to recreating Hebrew. So in some cases, he took the sound of a foreign word and used it in order to create a Hebrew word. So for instance, an airplane. So the word that we use today was actually formed by Bialik. We say matos. But the Ben-Yehuda word, which is Old Hebrew, but it's still used sometimes, is aviron. Why is it aviron? First of all, because avir is air. So it's something that flies in the air. But also because in French, it's avion. So we wanted something that would sound familiar. The same thing there are many words of Ben-Yehuda that were kept only in the family, that were not accepted in Hebrew. For instance, the word for slippers. Slippers, today we say in Hebrew, na'alei bayit, house shoes. But in my family, we say tuflaim. Tuflaim comes from either Yiddish or German or Russian. In Russian, it's tufli. In Yiddish and German, it's pantoflach. He gave it the pear shape, aim, yes, yadayim, einayim, raglayim, tuflaim, you have two. So he takes a foreign word and he makes it, it's like banana. It's half foreign and half Hebrew. So he was totally okay with that.
I have a question. As in Europe, did Eliezer Ben-Yehuda, not yet Ben-Yehuda, did he read or was he aware of Mendele Moiches Forum's Hebrew novels?
Of course, yes. And not only Mendele, but also other Jewish writers. There was writing in Hebrew before him. His big achievement is something else. His big achievement is the spoken Hebrew. This never happened in the history of mankind and never reoccurred in the history of mankind. The rise from the dead of a language that no longer existed. Whenever I travel the world and lecture about Hebrew and the revival of Hebrew, people always ask me, how can we do it? So for instance, in Catalonia, they're really trying to reclaim Catalan. They're really trying for political reasons, like Eliezer Ben-Yehuda's revival of Hebrew was for political reasons, of course. And they want to reclaim Catalan because they want their liberty and they want their identity. And I tell them, you won't make it. It will never happen to you. And you know why? Because you're too well off. Because what would happen to you if you do not reclaim Catalan? It would be very sad. And I'm all for your liberty and I'm all for your culture, but you won't die. When I was invited, before Joseph spoke about what would have happened if, when I was invited by the authorities of Belarus, today Luzhki, the native village of Eliezer Ben-Yehuda, is in Belarus. It used to be Lithuania, now it's Belarus. I was invited to a very big ceremony of laying a big stone at the front of what is assumed to be the house he was born in. And it was a very nice ceremony, very emotional. And then after the ceremony, they took us a kilometer away to a forest and showed us the mass grave of 450 Jews from the ghetto of Luzhki that were assassinated. And for Eliezer Ben-Yehuda, it was clear. It was Hebrew or death. For the Catalonians, I'm all for them. And I'm all for, the liberty of the Catalonians and the Palestinians and you name it. But it's not a matter of life or death. It's a matter of pride. It's a matter of a lot of stuff. But this is not enough to make a child speak a dead language. So this happened only with Eliezer Ben-Yehuda. This is his achievement.
We have a question, two questions from
From outer space.
Yes, from outer space. One is, how did Hebrew spread so effectively that there were so many Hebrew speakers in a short amount of time? This regards the protests against German at the university. What was the framework? How did schools spread? And the second one is a technical question. Could you give us the names of Ben-Yehuda's children and grandchildren?
So the spread of Hebrew, again, was a political thing. So there are wonderful, wonderful, wonderful letters of citizens to the municipality of Tel Aviv. So Tel Aviv was founded in 1909 when Hebrew was already present, but not necessarily the main language of the culture of the country. And letters of citizens in Tel Aviv writing the municipality in 1930 about plumbing, sewage, lighting, etc., in Yiddish. And the reply they get from their city hall is, this is a Hebrew city. If you want to get service, write in Hebrew. So it was a fight. It was a war, and it was imposed on people. So this is how it spread, and of course through schools. The names. So Eliezer Ben-Yehuda married Dvorah Yonas. Their only two remaining children were Itamar ben Avi, my grandfather, and Yemima, my grandfather's sister. And then he married Chemda, and with Chemda he had a boy and three girls, Ehud, and then Dola, Ada, and Zaza, Zilpa. And then it goes on and on and on. But usually, when they want to hear about Eliezer Ben-Yehuda, they always address me because I can never shut up. So it's very easy to call the youngest sibling and to make me talk about Eliezer Ben-Yehuda.
How come there were some words that were not adopted that he invented? Like, what distinguished those words from the rest of them?
First of all, it's a matter of luck. Some of them were not good. And again, we should remember that Bialik revived more words, invented more Hebrew words than Eliezer Ben-Yehuda. Eliezer Ben-Yehuda's achievement, again, is the spoken language and the dictionary. But if we're talking about inventing words, so there are words of Eliezer Ben-Yehuda that Bialik just made better. For instance, the word for a tomato. Bialik said agvania, as we say today, agvania, because in French it's pomme d'amour, the apple of love, and agvania comes from agavim in Hebrew. Eliezer Ben-Yehuda thought that it's dirty, it's too sexy, and he wanted us to say badura, because in Arabic it's bandora. So he gave the Arab sound. Some other words just weren't lucky enough, but I'll tell you another story. There are two words that we are all saying in a wrong way, and I'll tell you why. So how did Eliezer Ben-Yehuda invent words? Not alphabetically, but by topics. 1 week, words for finance. 1 week, words for agriculture. 1 week, words for literature. 1 week, and 1 week, it was working about words for culture. And he would be working on cards. And by the end of the day, he would call his children and tell them, take those words and spread them around. And the kids would run the streets of Jerusalem, which was a very small city, and shout like newspaper sellers, new words by Ben-Yehuda, new words by Ben-Yehuda. From now on, you don't say chou-fleur, you say courgette. You don't say ice cream, you say glida. You don't say tomato, you say badura, etc., etc. Some were accepted and some not. So that week, Eliezer Ben-Yehuda was working on words for culture. And he wanted to create a word for an orchestra and a word for melody, for a melody. So in Hebrew, an orchestra is mangina. And melody is tizmoret. Now, those of you who know Hebrew would see that it's logical because an orchestra is a group of people that makes the tune happen. היא מנגינה את הצלילים. And a melody is the accumulation of all the sounds. It's the tizmoret of all the... But the kids, idiots, got it the other way around. And with our luck, these words were accepted. And they came home and they told him, what have we done? He said, shh, don't tell anyone. I'll write it like this in the dictionary. Nobody will know. And it was a very well-kept secret in our family until I put it into one of my books. And now it's, but a Jew would make everything for $1. So I sold it, you know.
Last call for questions.
if you were to raise him from the dead 100 years later, not even drop him in the middle of Tel Aviv, because that would be shocking to anybody, but put a newspaper in front of him, how do you think he would feel about where the language has evolved to at this point, with loanword, with everything else that is involved in the modern Hebrew language? How do you think he would feel about that evolution?
I believe he would be elated. And I explain why. As Jews and as Israelis, we have had quite a few defeats in our history. And we did a lot of wrong things. And some of the stuff in Zionism just doesn't work. Hebrew is a brilliant victory. It's a live language. Look at me. I was born in Hebrew. I can be stupid in Hebrew. I will die in Hebrew. I can write poetry in Hebrew. Who would have believed? And for him, this is what he wanted. This is what he was dreaming of. He really didn't care whether Hebrew would be beautiful, clean, you name it. It's just that it's not any other language. It's ours. So for him, the fact that Hebrew today has lots of tech and lots of Russian and lots of Arabic, of course, and lots of Ethiopian words absorbed into modern Hebrew, that's wonderful because it's ours.
And Yiddish.
And Yiddish. Even Yiddish is re-kosher. Thank you very, very, very much again. And I hope to see you soon. Shalom, shalom. Thank you.